rather than just. This is why the revision of a dissertation is often not so much a mechanical process, though it's that too, as a reformation of oneself, not from the inside, but from a product of one's author function. I say all this because one of my jobs as an editor is to remind people that they're writing for a public audience, which is absolutely critical in thinking the distinction between a dissertation and a book. But to say write for the public is not exactly helpful to a scholar trying to convey an argument from within a given position to a range of other communities of readers. The result can be projects that misjudge audiences, either writing from within so narrow a conversational horizon that they can't possibly reach beyond 150 people, or written so broadly as though in emulation of public intellectuals that one can scarcely imagine readers beyond the more indulgent members of the author's family. It helps to remember, I think, that the most famous academics generally became famous through richly detailed and carefully researched and argued first and second books that are usually relatively conventional in form. One writes Speech and Phenomenon before Glas. One writes Scenes of Subjection before Wayward Lines, Beautiful Experiments. Not all books have the same audience. Actually, no two books have the same audience, but not all books should try to have the same sort of audience either. Interdisciplinary work is not better or worse than more narrowly focused work, though the two may find different publishers and different prices in the marketplace. Don't try to write something you don't want to write, and don't try to pitch your work as something other than it is, though you also shouldn't shy away from making explicit the full import of what it is you've accomplished. I think it was Bakhtin who said that the psyche is a border phenomenon, something that happens at the bounds between people. Writing is the same. The idea of it pouring out of the depths of the solitary individual is a myth, and so is the idea of it being fed as so much slop to a general audience. In the United States, in any case, there's no such thing. That's what editors mean when they say that a book's market is crucial. Not that you write for everybody, but rather that books perform an intricate dance, placing the author in the arms of an audience they want to mark out for a project, as well as the audience that marks them out. That means that when editors think about authorial stature, they're not thinking about established facts. They're thinking about authors who are always becoming authors. Most of us are far less interested in publishing famous people than in publishing authors who give the most impressive display of how to dance the dance, whatever garb they came in. In fact, editors' favorite books tend to be those first and second books in which an author really announces themselves to readers with rigor and with style. When thinking of readers, one generally pictures one's ideal reader, Professor so-and-so, whose brilliant work in theorizing such and such is what got you in this business to begin with. But it's even more important to be thinking of people who aren't your ideal readers, but who ought to read your book anyway. These are people who work on material related to yours, but by way of a different intellectual pedigree, a different discipline, even a different time, say 5 years from now. Sometimes the abstraction of thinking of a future graduate student reading you is a helpful way to both locate and depersonalize your audience. It may also be useful to imagine explaining your project to someone in another discipline 1 or 2 degrees away from yours. You're on a committee and strike up a conversation with somebody in the music department, in art history, something like that. How would you explain what you're doing and why it matters to them? The task isn't to dumb it down. Rather, it's to step back from the intricacies of years' research in order to make sure you don't lose those people who haven't traveled your particular path. Editors are themselves just such people. We're not scholars, and despite our enthusiasms, we can't navigate all the ins and outs of a scholarly controversy. We want to see, of course, that authors have a mastery of those ins and outs, but don't forget to remind us, within the bounds of ordinary scholarly prose, of the animating questions that made you care about the topic to begin with. The best books and the strongest candidates for publication at a university press are the ones that work rigorously through a consequential question in a way that is communicative. Since rigor and communication can sometimes seem like competing impulses, though they shouldn't, let me offer 4 suggestions for how to position yourself in the act of writing. First, recognize and internalize that now you are the expert. Your chief task is no longer to prove yourself, but to convey to others what you've already proven to yourself as lucidly and scrupulously and interestingly as possible. The second is especially crucial for book proposals, but also for a range of other places where you're discussing your work, and that's to understand the difference between a proper book description and an abstract. In short, don't write abstracts. The abstract, and I'm stealing this from Bill Germano, is the shriveled remains of a project description. The abstract is your book's autopsy report. A proper proposal doesn't try to distill 300 pages down to 3. Rather, it explains why you wanted to write 300 pages in the first place. That means you're not trying to include every element of a book in reduced form. You're giving an overview of why you're writing the book, and in general terms, how. My third piece of advice, and bear with me if this sounds like I'm saying something I'm not, is to free your writing from jargon. Now, what I mean by jargon differs from how the word is sometimes tossed around. Jargon isn't big words or complicated words or words whose eradication gives purpose to the lives of culture warriors. Jargon is when you let a word do the work of thinking. If you can develop a much abused term like postmodernism with the imagination, rigor, and attention to contradiction of a Frederick Jameson, then you have my admiration. It almost doesn't matter that the book is probably wrong in some crucial ways because it's so productively wrong. But where a word starts to look like a shortcut, that's where you lose readers and yourself. This could be words like postmodern, which is typically is little more than a slogan intended to yoke together some very different intellectual cultural movements in order to dismiss them. But it could also be a lot of other words that are more pedestrian, including many that are favorites of those very politicians, cultural critics, and administrators who most like to decry scholarly obfuscation. Freedom, leadership, innovation. I don't mean you shouldn't address big issues, but make sure you haven't fallen into the trap of thinking that jargon is how you bolster your scholarship. Too often, jargon gets in the way of scholarly rigor. Think rather of how many conceptual breakthroughs have come about when people start to question some formulation that they've long taken for granted. So when I say eliminate jargon from your writing, I'm not talking about eliminating a class of words or suggesting you avoid engaging with complicated formulations. I'm merely asking that you be the one making the argument, not your vocabulary. Don't be afraid to use words, but keep your arguments sensitive to their limitations. For a few quite gifted writers, this sensitivity is the very condition of setting words to a page. For most of us, it's not. Rather, writing means cranking out whatever junk you can, and then this responsibility becomes the condition of how you revise and revise and revise again. My advice about jargon holds for just about any sort of writing you might care to undertake, but it probably requires special comment when it comes to conversations that go under the heading of theory. Another way of putting my advice might be chew your theory. Don't lean on theorists. Develop your own work, whether in conversation with theory or not, according to what the work most rigorously demands of you. And don't, for God's sake, buy into the banal, anti-intellectual truism that theory means bad writing. It can, unfortunately. We've all experienced this. But Derrida, Butler, and Adorno are read as widely as they are because they are excellent writers. And that excellence isn't because they shoot big, abstract ideas out of a bazooka. It's because of the thoughtfulness and precision with which they develop consequential but very specific lines of thought that account for real experiences. My fourth and final piece of advice is to pay attention to the pressures that make one submit a book too quickly or too slowly. These are different pressures, and it's possible for a single book to suffer from both. For the one, I've seen some of the smartest people in the profession fall into the trap of perfectionism, and in a very particular way, these are typically people for whom the very great virtue of self-criticism is also a curse. It's one thing to push an argument as far as it will go, and this is something I really look for in a book. But at the same time, I've also seen people for whom this important impulse results in holding onto a book until they've not only written it, but also rewritten it as the response to the original book, and perhaps also the response to the response also. I can completely understand the feeling that after you've struggled for 5 or 10 years with the topic, there must be something better to say than what you thought it was for the last 5 or 10 years. But I'd warn people to be cautious of that impulse. The best way to move beyond what you've been writing is to publish that version and write your next book in response to it. Conclusions are also a good place to gesture at some beyond without chucking everything you've already written. But at the same time, books are often published so soon, not because they needed further development, though some of them do, but because the writing itself is more needed more careful attention. I've seen brilliant books that sell 200 that 200 people will read because they have to, and where I couldn't help but think that one more conscientious round of revision might have yielded a book that 1,000 people read because they want to. Not having written a book myself, I can only imagine how much one desires to be done with it. But the most productive way to satisfy that desire is to congratulate yourself on being done with the argument and commit to a content-free round of revision, in which you take a couple of months to revisit every sentence. Make it sing, really. Cut a word or two from every line. Add a few words where they clarify an antecedent. Break up some of the longer sentences. Look for a simpler way to say the same thing. Not only will you slim your manuscript without losing any chapters, you may make the difference between a book that is a chore and a book that is a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom. This was very, very eloquent way of giving us so much advice. I really appreciate it. Again, I don't want to spend too much time with pleasantries, so I'm just going to jump in again and invite Maria to share her wisdom with us. Thank you, Maria. Thank you for being here.
Hello, hi there, and thank you so much for organising um, this event. My apologies for a slight late entry. As you can probably tell from my accent, I'm based in Cambridge at the moment, and I got the time difference completely mixed up. So, what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit about um, sort of the process. I think Thomas has laid out really lovely for all of us, sort of the sort of the philosophy of putting together your proposal and what you're thinking about when you're putting that together, as well as the sort of final written manuscript. Um, I want to start off by saying what I look after is Middle Eastern and African studies at Cambridge. And so some of what I'm saying is going to be quite specific for what I personally do. The discipline that I work in isn't necessarily a sort of departmental discipline, but it's quite a geographical spread. So I tend to think about things a little bit more interdisciplinarily than potentially some of my colleagues do at other university presses. But a lot of what I say will carry on over to other places. Um, and one of the first things that you need to do when you're starting to think about book proposals is really sort of get a lay of the land of what other publishing houses are doing. Sort of looking at your bookshelves, seeing what else you have on there, what inspires you, and what publishing houses publish those books. Um, Somewhere like Cambridge does to have a sort of geographical sort of way of organizing our history and politics sections, but somewhere like Oxford, say, or somewhere like Harvard does not have that sort of aspect to it. So you're really sort of thinking about what publishing house works for your book as much as thinking about sort of approaching us as if we're the sort of pinnacle of this conversation. It's a conversation that has to go two ways, right? So sort of seeing if you're a good fit for us, as well as us seeing if your proposal is a good fit for our list. And I think what Tom said about remembering that not everything might well be the right fit is really important because that's not saying that it's a bad proposal or that this won't be a successful book. It's just that in this moment in time, the list that the editor might well be working on or the focus that the editor might well have is just not where your book proposal is. But that's not to say that somewhere else doesn't have a good fit for you or that you're not a good fit for somewhere else. Um, so yeah, so that I mean that's part of what striking up a conversation with an editor is about, is sort of seeing how you can have a conversation and build a professional relationship with the editor and with the press and with the list. And that's what the proposal can stand for as well. And I think that's why, like Tom said, you really want that proposal to be concise, to sort of hammer home straight away exactly what the aim of your project is. Because it won't just be me that will be looking at your proposal. It will also be colleagues in our sales and marketing departments. It will also be colleagues in our publicity departments. And their job isn't to be involved in the content. Their job is to sell your book. Their job is to get your book out there. And that the proposal document is how they will first be getting on board with your project. And so that's why, in a lot of ways, having a really concise, a really sort of thought through title, a really thought through first paragraph of that proposal is extremely important. I'm going to jump a little bit ahead because I think Tom laid out really nicely for us the process of writing the proposal and thinking about the manuscript. And what I'll talk a little bit about is at Cambridge and at many other university presses, peer review is what your book will go along the sort of route of. And at Cambridge, more often than not, with a first book, we do like to see a full manuscript sent out for review to peers prior to contract. And so the proposal document is what we use as a green light or a red light to requesting the full manuscript. So you don't need to send the full manuscript in straight away. You send the proposal through first, and then we will give you the sort of green light or red light for full manuscript. In some instances, in second book and third book, we might be prepared to send out just the proposal or a sample chapter for review. But like I said, with a first book, where someone hasn't yet been tried or tested in the book market, we like to be able to send a full manuscript out for review. And it's at this stage that I quite like to, and I'm not going to speak for all of my university press colleagues, I like to have a conversation with authors about the kinds of people that you think might be useful for me to be in touch with about a review. It will always be anonymous. You won't get their names, they won't get your names, but I find it a very useful process to go through in terms of knowing what sorts of people that you're talking to, what sorts of disciplines are you drawing on, what kind of markets are you speaking to with the manuscript by the sorts of people that you might well say, oh, it would be great if somebody from an anthropology department could take a look at this. It would be great if someone, this person who works on this certain aspect of, I mean, for me, Syrian politics looks at something. And it's a nice moment to be able to have that conversation with somebody, especially in controversial subject areas, to get a lay of their land as well. We tend to give about 3 months for the full peer review process to go through. I've got to say, and you will all know this much better than I do, the pressures of academia and the pressures of workload are high at the moment. I quite often get ghosted by reviewers at the moment. I don't know if you're finding this, Tom. And so if it isn't in that time frame, I'm chasing, the reviewers are getting my email saying, hello, have you had a chance to take a look at this yet? And we're in conversation, and I will often relay back to authors to say they need another couple of weeks, they need a little bit of time. But it's worth just checking in with your editor, saying, how's it going? Have you heard anything? But waiting until that deadline has passed before that happens. We are doing what we can to get things in on time. We also recognise that, especially with first books, sort of tenure track questions are extremely important at this stage. But yeah, so then once the reviews are in, we've got 3 options in front of us with sort of directions that we go in. One is where the reviews are sadly mixed or quite negative, and it's at that stage that we will part ways and hope that you'll be able to find another press for your work, and hope that the review process has given you ways in which to amend the manuscript that might well mean that the next press can take this on. There's something that we call a revise and resubmit option, which is where the reviews are mixed, or there's one that's great and there's one that has sort of quite major suggestions for you. So what we'll say is, we'd like to offer this revise and resubmit option. You go away, you look at ways in which you can implement the suggestions of the reviewers, and then the manuscript will go back to one of the original 2 or 3 reviewers. At Cambridge, it's just one. I'm not sure at other presses they might well possibly want both of the reviewers to look at it, but it's just one. And then take it forwards or not based on that clearance review is what we call that review. And then there's the third option, which is where there's, maybe minor suggestions here and there, a couple of bits of literature that the reviewers might well want you to take on board. And at that stage, we can take it forward to our press editorial boards. Each university press's editorial board will be made up of slightly different people and have slightly different components to them. Ours is made up of members of the university. So somebody from maths, somebody from physics, somebody from history will all sit on this board. And they're not so much to check on the content, but to check that the peer review process has gone according to plan, that you're engaging well with the reviews, that I've done my job properly with the reviews. And it's at that stage that we can offer a contract once it's been approved by our press. I will stop there because I think it might be quite useful if anybody had any questions or anything else that they might want either me or Tom to go over a little bit more. But yeah.
Sorry.